Did you know that Max Verstappen won at Imola with a move that combined psychology, technique, and a mistake by McLaren? And that's not all. The victory could be the start of a comeback that will change the championship. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, do you think Max can take the title again this year? What did Red Bull do differently this time that even McLaren couldn't answer? Today we're breaking down how Max Verstappen dominated the 2025 Imola GP, from the technical evolution of the RB21 to the overtake that left Oscar Piastri speechless. Max Verstappen arrived at the 2025 Imola Grand Prix in a complex but strategic situation. The season hadn't been easy for Red Bull, with a start plagued by technical challenges and increasingly aggressive competition from McLaren and Ferrari. Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris have been racking up podiums and points with a consistency that forced Verstappen to find more than just speed. He needed surgical precision, tactical intelligence, and above all, flawless execution. Imola wasn't just another stop on the calendar, it was a territory where Verstappen had already made his name with force. For consecutive victories before this edition made him the master of a circuit that punishes mistakes and rewards absolute technical mastery. But what was expected was more than a victory. Red Bull needed to send a message, to demonstrate that the fight for the championship was still wide open and that its star driver still had many cards to play. Imola, with its historic layout and high-speed corner configuration combined with technical traction sections, represents one of the biggest challenges on the calendar. It's a circuit where just having a fast car isn't enough. It requires balance, strategic intelligence, and a deep understanding between driver and team. Verstappen knows this, and that has made him a silent threat since Friday. Although the Dutchman's statements before the weekend seemed cautious, his approach spoke volumes. He wasn't here to score points, he was here to make up ground. And that context made him even more dangerous for his rivals. Red Bull arrived at the circuit, knowing it couldn't afford to make mistakes, much less against a McLaren that, while fast, continued to show signs of weakness when the pressure was on. That was the real tension of the weekend, knowing that any false move could define the course of a championship. While some teams were banking on continuity in their setups, Red Bull arrived with a clear strategy, not just to compete, but to evolve. Their technical approach to Imola wasn't simply a response to their rivals' performance, but a complete reinterpretation of their aerodynamic philosophy. They weren't reacting, they were anticipating. This allowed Verstappen to have at his disposal a deeply modified RB21, specifically designed to exploit its strengths on circuits with medium and high-speed corners. From that point on, the pressure shifted directly onto McLaren's shoulders, which had to defend its points, lead knowing that Verstappen was on his favorite stage. With qualifying approaching and the track beginning to heat up, everything indicated that the Grand Prix would not only be another race, but a defining test of character for both the teams and their drivers. Red Bull didn't arrive at Imola to tweak a pair of wings. They arrived with a complete reinvention of the RB21. The heart of that package was the redesign of the Venturi channels, a new profile that increased downforce in fast corners by 13% without penalizing drag. This gain allowed Verstappen to confidently lean into critical sectors like AC Minerali and Piratella, where any loss of downforce translates into tenths of a second that can't be recovered. Added to that pillar was a more cambered side floor and a revised wing beam. Working in tandem, the two components smoothed out the vortices that had previously plagued the rear wing and, in the process, pushed the RB21 to exceed 340 km per hour at the end of the main straight. The car wasn't just faster, it was stable, a combination few achieve when the threshold of aerodynamic drag is reached. The other side of the coin was thermal management. At Imola, tire temperatures remained within the ideal window for 78% of the race, a jump from the figures seen in Bahrain and Miami. This thermal stability prevented the dreaded graining and allowed Max to squeeze more laps out of each tire before feeling the degradation. With the tires in good condition, the clock was on his side. Verstappen strung together 18 consecutive laps in 1 minute and 18.5 seconds on the hard compound, a consistent pace that forced McLaren to bring Piastri's pit stop forward and make the mistake that would ultimately decide the race. Degradation was so low, just 0.3% per lap compared to the MCL 39, that the Dutchman was able to stretch his first stint to lap 19 and exit the pits with the medium tire at a better temperature than his direct rival. This strategic coolness was born from the simplest of facts. The less rubber you lose, the more flexible you are when deciding when to stop. Red Bull also fine-tuned the electric delivery. The engine map released power from the ERS right at the end of braking, synchronized with Verstappen's technique of applying 15% more pressure to the left brake. This combination loaded the front axle without locking it and gave him the precise boost to launch off the exit of Tamburello. On a circuit where DRS zones are limited, every extra joule of power counts. All of this didn't come about in a weekend. Hours of simulator and wind tunnel testing allowed them to model the interaction between the new surface and the wings under Imola's rough terrain. The result was a chassis that rotated without complaint and electric power that delivered like a whiplash just when the driver needed traction. If the rivals expected to find a Red Bull vulnerable after the difficulties of the early season, they found themselves with a transformed car. This technical leap not only supported the decisive move against Piastri, it set the stage where a strategic error by McLaren became irremediable, and that's where the race began to be decided. The race had entered a critical phase. Oscar Piastri, who until then had maintained a solid defense, was put under pressure that only Max Verstappen knows how to exert. The location of the maneuver was no coincidence. The Tamburello corner, one of the fastest and most technical corners on the circuit, was chosen by the Dutchman not on impulse, but by pure strategic reading. He took advantage of the suction generated by the McLaren at the exit of Rivazza, knowing that the proximity of that section would allow him to prepare a clean overtake without exposing himself to a possible block. It is in these kinds of decisions that separate the good driver from the one capable of making history. The difference was in the details. While many expected Verstappen to attempt a more conventional pass under braking on the main straight, he opted for something less predictable and more risky, positioning himself on the outside right at the edge of the apex. What seemed like madness from the outside was, in reality, a move calculated to the millimeter. Verstappen knew that the RB21, with its new aerodynamic setup, would allow him to take a more open line without losing grip. This precision not only guaranteed stability in the middle of the corner, but also better positioning to accelerate ahead of his rival at the exit. Post-race telemetry confirmed the brutal execution of the maneuver. Verstappen entered Tamburello with an entry speed 8 km/h higher than Piastri's. This was no coincidence. It was due to the perfect balance of the car, enhanced by the reduction in understeer that Red Bull had achieved with its latest floor upgrade. Furthermore, the energy recovery system was programmed to deliver power instantly upon exiting that section, which was key to consolidating the maneuver without Piastri being able to counterattack on the following straight. A less obvious, but equally relevant, point was the differentiated use of the brakes. According to data revealed by GPS analysis, Verstappen applied 15% more pressure on the left brake during the corner entry. This specific technique increased mass transfer to the front axle, which helped rotate the car without having to reduce speed more than necessary. In other words, he braked harder on one side to keep the car balanced, gain entry angle, and protect himself from a potential closure by the Australian. This action, invisible to the general public, is a demonstration of absolute technical mastery. The emotional context also played an important role. For Verstappen, Imola isn't just a track where he feels comfortable, it's a terrain he knows down to the level of muscle memory. In his own words, "It's a circuit that pushes me to naturally seek my limits." That familiarity with the environment was vital to his daring to execute a maneuver of such complexity without hesitation, at a time when any mistake could have meant losing more than a position. It wasn't simply about speed, but about confidence in his tools and his ability to read every inch of the track. Meanwhile, Oscar Piastri was left with no options. The choice of his defensive line, combined with a tire that was already showing signs of wear, left him completely exposed to an attack of that magnitude. Even his team acknowledged after the race that there was no possible response at that point. McLaren had opted to maintain their position through strategy, but they hadn't counted on Verstappen having complete control over every mechanical, mental, and tactical variable of the race. Thus, one of the finest maneuvers of the season was sealed. Verstappen's move at Tamburello was the most visible blow, but the foundation that allowed for its execution was laid long before from the McLaren pit wall. There, In the area where strategy must be infallible, a decision was made that determined the fate of the race, calling Oscar Piastri into the pits on lap 14. The intention was clear. The team was banking on the undercut, on the possibility of cutting time with fresh tires and getting ahead of Verstappen when he made his pit stop. On paper, it seemed like a reasonable move. But Formula One isn't decided on paper, but on real-time data, real degradation, and unpredictable rivals. And therein lay the failure. The first thing McLaren underestimated was the RB21's ability to extend the first stint. Thanks to the improvements implemented at Imola, Verstappen's Red Bull showed significantly less degradation than in previous races. The Milton Keynes engineers had redesigned the cooling fins on the side pods, which reduced overheating of the rear tires and allowed them to maintain a constant temperature within the optimal performance window. This small improvement was enough for Verstappen to maintain a solid and consistent pace without sacrificing the integrity of the hard tires. While Piastri tried to generate an undercut advantage, Verstappen remained on track with identical times, but without the risk of overheating. Furthermore, McLaren overlooked an essential aspect: Verstappen's ability to manage tires in critical situations. It's not a new trait, but it remains overlooked by many. Since his time at Toro Rosso, Max has perfected the art of driving fast without punishing the tires, especially in moments where the race is defined by conservation decisions rather than raw speed. This skill was crucial, because while Piastri squeezed the new set of medium tires trying to build an advantage, Verstappen did so with a used set of tires, staying within the same lap time margin. The direct consequence was that, when Max pitted on lap 19, he had only lost 1.1 seconds to Piastri, a gap that the slipstream and traction of the RB21 almost immediately negated. The most serious aspect of McLaren's tactical error wasn't miscalculation but rigidity. Instead of adapting the strategy on the fly when they saw that Verstappen wasn't slowing down, they stuck to the initial plan. This lack of flexibility is lethal in Formula One. If your rival doesn't do what you expected, the worst move you can make is to remain blind to the change. And that's exactly what happened. By the time Red Bull saw the perfect window to make its pit stop without losing position, it was too late for McLaren to correct. What should have been an offensive move turned into a failed reaction. It's also worth considering that the MCL39's own design showed limitations that exposed Piastri at key moments. The car didn't respond as it should in the fast sections of the circuit, especially in the Rivazitosa sequence. There, GPS data showed a loss of at least 0.15 seconds per lap compared to the RB21. And when you're on an aggressive strategy, every tenth of a second counts. McLaren team principal Andrea Stella frankly acknowledged after the race, the car wasn't built to dominate on tracks with more than 60% of the time in high-speed corners, as is the case at Imola. This technical deficit, combined with a poorly executed strategy, made defense impossible. In retrospect, Piastri's pit stop was more a sign of insecurity than an aggressive gamble. They wanted to get ahead of Red Bull without having the full conditions to sustain that initiative. And when Verstappen responded with more pace, better tire management, and a maneuver that left his rival with no room to maneuver, the error was exposed. It wasn't an isolated failure. It was a chain of small bad decisions that, together, ultimately cost them the victory. The victory at Imola was much more than just a points tally for Max Verstappen. It was a statement of intent, clear proof that Red Bull hasn't lost its ability to innovate or its competitive instinct. But it was also a warning to the rest of the field. The three-time champion and his team have once again found solid technical direction, and with it, a real opportunity to reverse the course of the championship. With the gap to Oscar Piastri reduced to just 22 points, the margin for error is dangerously narrowing for McLaren, and what seemed like a comfortable lead at the start of the season is now beginning to wobble in the face of a rejuvenated Red Bull, which is already planning its next major technical offensive ahead of the Spanish GP. According to internal team sources, what was seen at Imola wasn't the complete package, but merely the beginning of a series of modifications designed to completely transform the RB21's performance on more technical and hotter circuits. Among the expected parts are a new front wing profile with greater flex resistance, specifically designed to comply with the latest restrictions imposed by the FIA, as well as a completely redesigned cooling system, which will seek to solve the overheating problems Red Bull faced at tracks like Bahrain and Miami. This new system aims to maintain stable thermal performance in extreme conditions, crucial for races like those upcoming in Spain, Canada, and Austria, where ambient temperatures and punishing traction will test the limits of all cars. Furthermore, there is an even more strategic issue on the horizon. Evolution is not only technical but also mental. Motivated by a circuit where he feels invincible, Verstappen has regained a much more aggressive but also mature attitude. He doesn't need to constantly take risks to make a difference. His precision, his understanding of the race, and his knowledge of the car allow him to capitalize on other people's mistakes with impressive efficiency. That mindset, combined with the new modular development philosophy Red Bull is applying to the RB21, creates a scenario where the team can adapt the car to each track with a versatility that could become its greatest competitive advantage. They no longer seek to impose their style on each circuit, but rather decode the specific characteristics of each track to offer Max the exact tools he needs at the right time. On the other hand, while McLaren tries to stabilize its leadership, Red Bull is in the midst of a tactical reconstruction phase. There is growing talk in the paddock about the possibility of Ferrari trying to attract Verstappen in the future, but within the Austrian team, there is a calm not seen since the end of the dominant RB18 era. There is a sense that the technical and human process the team is undergoing is not only working, but is forming a new competitive core capable of challenging even in its lowest moments. The lesson from Imola was not only that the RB21 can win races. Red Bull, when pressed, responds not with urgency, but with planning, technology, and an adaptability that remains a benchmark in Formula One today. This renewed drive is also reshaping the upcoming races on the calendar. Monte Carlo, the Hungaroring, and Silverstone pose completely different challenges: surgical precision on the street, thermal demands and pure traction in Hungary, and maximum aerodynamic efficiency at the speed of England. Red Bull is already working on 3 different configurations of the same chassis to adapt to these environments, and Verstappen, who already knows what it's like to lead under pressure, will now have the opportunity to attack from a position of growth. If he can remain consistent, it won't be a surprise to see him go into the summer break as the championship leader, even after what many described as the most difficult start of his recent career.